The architecture of atmospheric terror, a psychological and sociological analysis of ambient abuse. Ambient abuse represents a highly covert, pervasive form of psychological manipulation characterized by the intentional creation of a hostile, unpredictable, or anxiety-inducing environment. Unlike overt behavioral abuse, physical violence, or explicit verbal insults, ambient abuse relies on low-intensity, nonverbal, and structurally deniable tactics. This paper synthesizes psychological, sociological, and trauma-informed literature to define ambient abuse, analyze its core operational mechanisms, map its symptomatology on targets, and differentiate it from normative interpersonal conflict. Introduction and definitional framework. The conceptualization of interpersonal trauma has historically focused on overt, measurable behavioral acts. However, clinical and sociological research increasingly recognizes the pathogenic nature of atmospheric or ambient mistreatment. Ambient abuse is defined as the systemic alteration of a shared environment, whether domestic, professional, or familial, to induce chronic hypervigilance, psychological disorientation, and cognitive erosion in a target. It operates not through distinct episodic boundary violations, but through a continuous baseline of tension. The defining feature of ambient abuse is plausible deniability. The individual tactics are so subtle, micro-behavioral, or contextual that, when isolated, they appear innocuous or accidental to external observers. Core operational mechanisms and tactics. Ambient abuse relies on structural and nonverbal maneuvers that bypass standard behavioral metrics of abuse. Micro-behavioral hostility and nonverbal cues. Perpetrators utilize subverbal communication channels to signal disapproval, threat, or disgust without committing to a statement that can be challenged. Somatic signaling, heavy sighs, micro-expressions of content, eye rolling, or sudden shifts in body language when the target enters a room. Proximity manipulation, entering or leaving spaces abruptly to disrupt the target's physical comfort or utilizing aggressive posturing that stops short of physical intimidation. The cold atmosphere. Radiating a palpable, unvoiced anger that forces the target to inquire about the perpetrator's emotional state. Relational and environmental unpredictability. Stabilizing a target requires consistent rules. Ambient abuse thrives on the intentional destabilizing a target. Intermittent reinforcement. Arbitrarily alternating between cold indifference, subtle hostility, and brief periods of warmth or normalcy. This creates a biological addiction to seeking approval. Moving goalposts. Unspoken changes to expectations, domestic rules, or professional standards, ensuring the target is always inadvertently violating an unstated boundary. Ambient gaslighting. Altering the physical environment, moving items slightly, changing schedules without notice, or subtly rewriting social context to make the target question their memory, organizational skills, or sanity. Structural and information manipulation. Control is maintained by controlling the flow of ambient reality. Information hoarding, deliberately withholding logistical or social information necessary for the target to function effectively, then blaming them for their subsequent confusion or failure. Isolation via proxy, creating a social climate where others treat the target with coldness or suspicion, orchestrated via covert smear campaigns or subtle framing by the perpetrator. Psychological impact and trauma symptomatology. Because ambient abuse lacks a smoking gun evidence, its psychological toll is frequently severe, resulting in insidious internal degradation. Ambient stimuli such as sighs, silence, and mood shifts leads to cognitive appraisal. Is something wrong? Did I cause this? Leads to chronic hypervigilance, allostatic load, nervous system dysregulation. This leads to identity erosion, self-doubt, loss of agency, and learned helplessness. Allostatic load and nervous system dysregulation. Living in an ambiently abusive environment forces the human nervous system into a permanent state of threat appraisal. The sympathetic nervous system remains chronically activated, leading to elevated cortisol and adrenaline production, persistent autonomic arousals such as high heart rate variability and sleep disturbances, this wear and tear on your heart, ultimate somatic exhaustion or chronic fatigue, as the body cannot return to a ventral vagal state of safety. Cognitive erosion and overanalysis. Targets of ambient abuse allocate vast amounts of cognitive energy towards decoding the environment. This results in hypersized psychosis or hyperdecoding, the compulsion to analyze every door slam, tone shift, or text response latency for hidden threat. Internalized blame. To maintain a sense of control, the target internalizes the hostility, concluding, if I can just figure out what I did wrong and fix it, the environment will become safe again. Loss of epistemic trust. The target loses faith in their own senses, memory, and judgment, becoming entirely dependent on the perpetrator's baseline to define reality. Complex trauma and depersonalization. Over extended periods, ambient abuse mirrors the clinical presentation of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or CPTSD. Targets experience a slow erosion of identity, learned helplessness, and depersonalization, feeling like an empty shell operating within a minefield. Diagnostic differentiation, abuse versus normative conflict. A critical challenge in clinical settings is differentiating ambient abuse from situational relational distress or poor communication skills. Dimension, normative interpersonal conflict versus ambient abuse. Intent and pattern. Normative interpersonal conflict is episodic and tied to specific triggers or disagreements. Ambient abuse is continuous, independent of objective events. Let me see. Dimension. Normative interpersonal conflict is overt, even if dysfunctional, shouting and arguing. Ambient abuse is covert, atmospheric, and highly deniable. Power dynamics. Normative interpersonal conflict is symmetrical. Both parties express grievances. Ambient abuse, asymmetrical. One party holds systemic psychological control. The target state. Normative interpersonal conflict. Frustrated or upset, but retains a secure sense of reality. Ambient abuse, chronically hypervigilant, confused, and self-doubting. Accountability. Normative interpersonal conflict. Mutual repair or compromise is possible after a cooling period. Ambient abuse. It is denied, and requests for clarity are labeled as paranoia. Conclusion and therapeutic implications. Ambient abuse is a highly effective mechanism of psychological control precisely because it leaves no visible scars and evades traditional definitions of harm. It weaponizes the everyday atmosphere against the target, turning shared spaces into psychological battlegrounds. Therapeutic intervention requires shifting focus away from validating individual isolated events, which the perpetrator easily denies, and instead validating the cumulative systemic impact on the client's nervous system and sense of reality. Healing demands removing oneself from the toxic baseline, establishing absolute physical and psychological boundaries, and systemically rebuilding epistemic trust in one's own perceptions. The issue here being that it is the practitioner that is orchestrating the ambient abuse without informed consent after having been told to cease and desist in order to try to set up, discredit, and invalidate the target for calling the practitioner out on doing it without consent in the first place. This is ridiculous. They were told to stop.